Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into the muffled, wool-wrapped corners of a city that never shuts up. You're in 17th century Paris. It's night, but don't expect peace. Horse hooves clatter like an impatient metronome. Merchants argue even in their sleep, and somewhere a priest's voice echoes off a stone archway, still mid-sermon, hours after sunset. You tug your blanket up and sigh. Sleep in this city. Good luck. Now imagine trying to live through that with no earplugs, no sound machines, and walls made of cold stone that seem to echo every sneeze 3 times before giving you silence. Below, lanterns flicker like tired eyes. Somewhere to your left, 2 lovers argue with the full passion of a Shakespearean tragedy. It was a defining feature of life. Paris was dense, chaotic, alive in the way an anthill is alive, any inch filled with motion, chatter, and clamor. Unlike today's digitally manufactured chaos, this was the grinding humankind. Street cries, barking dogs, unmuffled carriages, no zoning laws, no double-paned windows. And because sanitation left much to be desired, men and women dumped chamber pots out the windows at dawn, sometimes yelling gardes low. To warn unlucky pedestrians, though, some skipped the warning entirely. Inside, things got interesting. Then imagine it draped in wool, velvet, or silk, woven into a lush forest scene where deer wander beneath stylized trees. It doesn't just look pretty, it sounds different. The room now has a hush. Footsteps become whispers. Voices soften. Difference is so subtle. It's like adding fog to a landscape view. Don't see less. But everything feels gentler. You could wake to 5 different calls before your morning bread. In some districts, watchmen were encouraged to sing or rattle keys to let people know they were on patrol. A merchant's cellar where the air grew cool and still. And in homes lucky enough or wealthy enough to invest in tapestries, there was a budding belief that silence wasn't just absence of noise. It was a kind of peace you could curate, layer by layer. This wasn't for fun. It was supposed to be comforting. Someone's out there watching. You meanwhile are just trying to get 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep before the chickens start. Paris was a city of bells, wedding bells, alarm bells, funeral bells. Their peals layered over each other until even joy sounded vaguely ominous. The kind stitched into the walls of rooms long vanished. Rooms where people once sat by candlelight, rubbing their ears, sighing and whispering finely. Wealthy Parisians began to crave something precious. Quiet. It wasn't just about comfort. Silence became a symbol of control. The rich would drape thick curtains around their beds, sometimes entire rooms. But it was the tapestry that changed the mood in the acoustics. But the impact on domestic soundscapes is undeniable. Wool traps, sound waves. The denser, the weave, the quieter the space. And for a noble trying to hold a dignified conversation without hearing the neighbor's quarrel next door, that was priceless. The resulting splashes weren't just gross, they were loud. Just sound bouncing off every hard surface like a child on too much sugar. A cat howls its opinion from the rooftop. A cart creaks under a load of cabbages, groaning like a pirate ship. Neighbors argued, and their voices passed through the walls like smoke. If you had a sensitive ear and a tendency to ruminate, Paris was your personal sound prison. It's midnight in Paris, but the city is alive with everything except sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where these little history voyages reach. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open the shutters and lean out over a street that smells faintly of wet wood and roasted chestnuts. In the 1600s, noise wasn't background. Even within the home, silence was elusive. Oh. The fire crackled. Floorboards groaned. The next room was never truly separate. There were no traffic lights, so drivers shouted directions or insults at each other constantly. Whip cracks echoed like thunder. But that was the external. Enter the tapestry. Or rather, imagine you're lying in bed staring at a blank, echoing wall. Before the rise of tapestries, medieval walls were mostly bare or hung with coarse linen. These absorbed nothing. Historians still argue whether the real motivation behind their spread was art, heat insulation, or sound dampening. Of course, this didn't fix the city itself. Churches rang bells at all hours, each with its own rhythm and agenda. One lesser-known oddity is the municipal night watch wasn't quiet either. And yet, despite this acoustic hurricane, there were pockets of softness. The occasional courtyard garden, a library behind thick stone doors. Tonight, you've already taken that first step by closing your eyes and letting Paris whisper you stories. You try to drift off, but the hooves start again. Not galloping, just the steady, relentless clop of horses pulling carts down uneven cobbles. Their iron shoes striking stone with a rhythm so precise it could be a lullaby. If lullabies came with creaking axles, driver curses, and the occasional crash of a cabbage barrel tipping over, even at night, the streets were alive with commerce, deliveries, gossip. Bread carts rumbled through the narrow passages before sunrise. Milk peddlers jostled for the best corners. Water carriers lugged their heavy loads, shouting to clear space. Most agree it didn't. Paris was not designed for sleep. It was designed for defense, for trade, for hierarchy. Comfort came later, if at all. You've lived on top of your neighbors, sometimes quite literally on. The clamor seeped through ceilings, floors, and walls. Now you can't close the window because it's your only air source. So instead, you listen. You count the wheels like sheep. 1 cart, 2 carts. Wooden shutters. Beds with heavy curtains pulled tight. It was a bit like building a soundproof box inside your room. It's a very expensive, very decorative box that also protected you from winter drafts and, arguably, bad dreams. A donkey brays in protest and you lose count again. All of it rolled over the city like waves on a cobbled sea. They rose early, napped strategically, and eventually at least the wealthy began to curate their homes like miniature fortresses against the sound. They wore Bell's little bronze ones tied to their harnesses. It helped identify them in the dark, especially for carriages returning home late. A cart passes, wheels rattling, the horses' bells chiming softly with each step. Then a cough from an open window, a muffled laugh, the hiss of rain on slate roofs. None of it is loud, exactly, but the accumulation is deafening. But all those jingling bells added yet another layer to the nighttime orchestra. In a world without consistent clocks, the sounds of the city helped tell time. You knew the baker was awake when the first oven doors slammed. You knew a neighbor was ill when their window stayed shut. Sound was social. It connected. No one knows why goats were kept upstairs in certain neighborhoods, but they were. And they had opinions, loud ones. That silence could be created, managed, tamed. Tapestries became part of that toolkit. But before that, it was all about layers. The clatter of hooves fades, replaced by the low murmur of a distant song drifting from an upstairs tavern. You breathe in, let your body sink, and accept that sleep tonight might arrive not through stillness, but through rhythm. In 17th century Paris, traffic never really stopped. Night pacing. Some insomniacs or simply overworked individuals would walk the streets late into the night, hoping the rhythmic movement would lull their bodies into sleep later. These walkers often became accidental part of the problem, their boots joining the nightly chorus of sound. Wooden wheels shriek like angry geese. Horses snort and stamp, their iron shoes scattering sparks against the stone. You didn't expect perfect silence, you just hoped no one dropped a chamber pot mid-dream, or worse, launched into an off-key rendition of a tavern song at 3 a.m. It happened, regularly. The streets of Paris were narrow, the buildings tall, and everything made of stone. So noise didn't travel a weight, bounced, echoed. It rebounded down alleys, slapping back and forth like a drunken accordion. That clop-clop of hooves could follow you for blocks, bouncing off the facades until it sounded like you were surrounded by a cavalry charge. The wealthier western neighborhoods had broader boulevards, private courtyards, and better enforcement of curfews. But even those zones couldn't escape the distant hum of the city. Noise was the invisible architecture of Paris. It shaped your sleep, your conversation, your thoughts. These weren't the polite carriages of later centuries. These were lumbering, functional beasts of burden hauling everything from wine to manure. You pull your head under a pillow, but it's no use. And the sound wasn't just loud, it was everywhere. Historians still debate the extent to which 17th century city planning accounted for acoustics. During this period, it was more than a way to cross the Seine. It was a marketplace, stage, and a traffic jam rolled into one. Horses clattered across its stones at all hours, dodging jugglers, poets, dentists, pulling teeth in full public view. That was daily life. Spectacle and uproar. Take the Pont Neuf, for instance, one of the city's most famous bridges. Imagine you're retrying to sleep on the 3rd floor of a building just a few blocks away. This relentless motion meant that people adapted their lives around the noise. Thick rugs on floors. But not everyone had access to such comforts. For most Parisians, sleep was an act of endurance. One fringe practice that's popped up in old journals. It wasn't just humans either. Dogs barked, chickens clucked, and occasionally, quite inexplicably, goats would bleat from upper windows. Some streets were quieter than others, of course. It's one thing few people think about. The horses themselves were a kind of mobile sound system. You try to picture it now. A dark Paris street. Lantern light flickers in puddles. The noise wasn't always considered bad either. Some found comfort in it. Still, as tapestries became more common, so did a new idea, that homes could be quiet on purpose. But for now, you're still in the city's embrace, wrapped not in silence, but in story. The walls are whispering again, not in words, but in echo soft. Ricocheting murmurs that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. You shift on your straw-stuffed mattress and press a palm against the cold stone wall beside you. It's firm, unyielding, and yet somehow alive. Every sound from the street, from the hallway, from the neighbor's soup slurping to floors up, pit all vibrates gently through the walls. It's funny in a maddening sort of way. In 17th century Paris, buildings weren't known for their acoustic privacy. They thought in terms of strength, durability, defense, and occasionally aesthetics, but certainly not tranquility. Not having to listen to your neighbor's nightly snoring ritual performed with operatic consistency. Right now, the walls are still bare. When they aren't echoing footsteps, they're carrying voices. Debates over fish prices, political rants, marital disputes, and gossip about the milkmaid's secret all filtered through the walls. Did it force a sense of community or breed resentment and paranoia? Some period diaries hint at friendships formed entirely through the wall. "I've never met her," one woman wrote of her upstairs neighbor, "but I know she weeps when she prays. We must get along. It's oddly touching." Sometimes you didn't even have to eavesdrop, the walls did it for you. There are records of noise complaints stretching back into the 1600s. Pauses mattered. People waited for the moment between bell tolls or the break in horse traffic to deliver their most delicate thoughts. And wealthy Parisians, especially those who hosted salons and discussions, began to reshape their homes around the idea of acoustic control. But before the grand halls of silence, before Versailles and courtly whispers, the walls simply had to be endured, listened to, whispered back to even. Carriages still rolled past. Servants whispered in stairwells. Children shrieked in courtyards. And gossip traveled faster than the Seine. And for the privileged few who had the luxury of design, certain rooms were built deep inside homes, buffered from street noise by layers of hallways and storage spaces. People used to knock rhythmically on their walls as a kind of Morse code to neighbors or lovers, a signal to come over, or to stay away, or, in one famous case, an annoyed musical retort to an off-key neighbor's nightly lute practice. To knocks means shut it, as the saying went. The complaints were rarely about loud parties. More often, they centered around everyday noises. Sermons got swallowed by domes. Choirs found their notes muddled. Some even draped sections of the sanctuary with cloth to try to tame the cacophony of worship. The irony wasn't lost on the clergy. "God may hear me," one monk supposedly muttered, "but these arches do not." Scraping furniture, thudding boots, the dreaded sound of a chamber pot being emptied at the wrong hour. And while lower-income Parisians made do with quilts and stacked furniture, the wealthy turned to their ultimate decorative fix: tapestries. It's made, stitched, layered. And in 17th century Paris, it began with the simple idea that maybe, just maybe, your walls didn't have to talk so much. The result: buildings that lasted centuries and shared their auditory secrets with everyone within earshot. Most were made of stone, which doesn't absorb sound, it amplifies it. Multi-story buildings housed several families, sometimes more, and the separation between units was mostly notional. Wooden floors groaned like ancient trees, but simple layers of cloths meant to soften echoes and mute the sound of city life bleeding through. It's solid, yes, but not quiet. The street noise returns in waves. Somewhere, someone is boiling water and humming. The rhythm of it travels right through your building like a ghostly lullaby. It was a poor man's solution to a problem the rich would later throw gold thread at. Ceilings creaked with every footstep. Even the creak of a bed in the next room could register as scandalous or hilarious, depending on your mood. Narrow streets trapped the city's clamor, and tall buildings turned each alley into a sort of vertical echo chamber. Even the most innocent of conversations could reverberate through the walls like a shouted confession in a canyon. You yawn, stretch, and try not to laugh as a sneeze from across the street echoes as if it came from inside your own room. Architects of the period weren't thinking about soundproofing. This was especially problematic for apartment-style living, which was common in Paris. You begin to see why people got creative. The need for acoustic privacy wasn't just about sleep. It was about dignity, decorum. But we're not there yet. In a city like this, conversation was public whether you liked it or not. Historians still argue whether this constant acoustic exposure made Parisians more tolerant or more irritable. But others weren't so sentimental. To deal with this, some Parisians began to hang heavy textiles on their interior walls, not yet the ornate tapestries of palaces. Even in churches, grand echo-prone marvels of the time priests struggled to be heard over their own acoustics. You trace a finger along the edge of your own wall, feeling where the stone meets a wooden beam. There was an unspoken art to learning when not to talk in such a city. These inner chambers became symbols of peace, a place to think, to write, to nap. Poets coveted them, philosophers sought them out, and that's where tapestries began to make their entrance, not just as aesthetic flourishes, but as practical, woven sound absorbers. One quirky practice you'd find in Paris. Even the upper classes, those with thick walls and private courtyards, couldn't fully escape the city's sonic reach. So as you lie there, surrounded by the soft breathing of a building alive with history, remember, silence is never absolute. Morning arrives not with sunlight, but with a crash. You jolt awake, though. Really, you hadn't been sleeping, not deeply, and the source of the noise reveals itself instantly. The slosh of a chamber pot, emptied from an upper window with questionable aim and zero grace. The street below hisses like it's offended, steam rising from the splash into the early chill. Welcome to a typical Parisian dawn in the 1600s. As you prop yourself up, still half tangled in your linen sheet, the true orchestra begins. A chorus of clanging shutters, yawning voices, clattering wooden shoes, and those ever-present cries. You know them, everyone does. 'Cause in 17th century Paris, the day starts not with a gentle stretch, but with the hawking of wares. Pain fray. Léon Courchat. Maybe it is because you'd have to be deaf not to hear everything else, too. A chorus of chickens from a merchant's coop answers back. Somewhere, a child is already crying. A dog howls in sympathy. This isn't a city waking up, it's a city erupting. Imagine being paid to shout at 6 in the morning about radishes. You'd need strong lungs and no neighbors. Jargon. They shout with gusto, as if the entire block were hard of hearing. And as cities grew louder, so too did efforts to buffer the individual from the collective. Others believed they were as individual as the sellers themselves. Each cry a signature, half marketing, half musical theater. Regardless, they weren't quiet. Certain times of day when staff were not to speak above a whisper, when music was paused, when doors were opened slowly, and footsteps tiptoed. But this was hard to enforce in a household of 20 servants and 3 excitable children, said the alternative. Change the environment itself. Your reality remained the same. Mornings were loud. Neighbors emptied chamber pots with little warning. And if you lived on the lower floors, you quickly learned to avoid walking directly beneath certain windows. The bakery's oven door slams like a guillotine. The bread has arrived. For some, these noises were comforting, familiar, like a daily song with 100 verses and no chorus. Not enforced by law, but by furious neighbors wielding broom handles and buckets of their own. It was a kind of noise and nastiness, diplomacy. You dump before 6, or we riot. Decorative wall hangings, not yet the full-scale tapestries we'll arrive at later, but early experiments in turning space into softness. Even Louis XIV, in the splendor of his rooms at the Louvre, wasn't spared the racket of construction, gossip, and rustling bureaucracy. He solved it by building Versailles and moving the court out of the city entirely, which is perhaps the most expensive method of noise reduction ever undertaken. And maybe that's the true paradox of Paris. For every sound that jars you awake, there's a scent that begs you to forgive it. You knew which day it was by which sellers passed your window. The fish seller didn't work Tuesdays. The bread boy always whistled when he had leftovers. It's rude. It's alive. It's completely beyond your control. Outside, the world is already halfway through its morning routine. A sanctuary of hush and hush alone. And to create that sanctuary, they'd soon need something more than quilts and polite whispers. Not in the modern architectural sense, but in the small, personal way. Thick curtains drawn across windows at dawn, chairs with padded feet, layered rugs, muffling steps, Andeous walls dressed in heavy cloth. Even the ceilings weren't safe. Some had fabric canopies stretched across beams to catch echoes before they could ricochet. Life had rhythm, and it marched to the beat of calloused feet and shouting mouths. Here comes the fishmonger, dragging a cart that squeaks like a broken violin. Historians still argue whether these street cries were standardized or improvised. Some claim vendors used melodic patterns passed down through generations, and they were relentless. Even the thickest shutters can't muffle the human enthusiasm for cabbage sales. Some vendors even hired boys with particularly loud voices just to do the shouting for them. Back inside your cramped, echo-prone lodging, there's no escape. But let's not pretend this was all unpleasant. Still, for anyone who craved sleep or simply pissed, the constant din was a problem. This is where domestic rituals began to shift. Wealthier Parisians started designating quiet hours within their homes. Enter the concept of acoustic design. Still, for the average citizen, none of that mattered. A quirky little fact: in some Parisian neighborhoods, there were actually unofficial zones where slop tossing was forbidden past certain hours. You shift now, imagining yourself back in bed, trying to snatch a few minutes more of rest, but it's hopeless. A goat bleats from the alley. The smells are divine. Fresh, yeasty air wafts in with the noise, as if the city is trying to apologize for waking you. You pull on your robe, likely a bit threadbare, 'cause linen wears quickly when it doubles as a blanket and summeran pad toward the window. And yet within the walls of the wealthier homes, those behind iron gates and manicured hedges, there is a different atmosphere entirely. These homes are already experimenting with acoustic boundaries. Servants trained to move quietly, drapes tied just so to limit echo. Even so, the morning noise finds them. No one is immune. But back in your own corner of the city, you sigh, letting your forehead rest against the window frame. It's noisy. That's why, for those who could afford it, the inner home became a sacred space. They'd need a wall that didn't talk back. They'd need woven silence. You step back from the window, still cradling the noise in your ears like a warm teacup that refuses to cool. The street remains a blur of motion and sound, but inside, you tug your door shut with care, too much care, maybe, and breathe out into the stillness of your space, if you can call it that. Because in 17th century Paris, privacy isn't really a given. Sound seeps through doors like water through a leaky roof. Nothing too extravagant, but his floors are waxed, and his halls smell faintly of orange peel and old books. There's a hush the moment you step inside, not because the house is silent, but because the walls are. But for the upper crust, those who live just a little farther from the clamor, The production of high-quality tapestries in France was heavily supported by the monarchy. Louis XIV, in particular, established the Manufacture des Gobelins in 1662, turning it into a royal enterprise. The densely packed wool, sometimes mixed with silk or gold threads, acts like a sponge for noise. Voices are less sharp. Steps are less harsh. Laughter doesn't echo like it's trying to escape. The tapestries created there became symbols of wealth, power, and refined, to stand unintentional pioneers in early acoustic control. Scenes of myth, battle, romance, or harvest. These weren't just paintings you could hang and forget. It wasn't about the story, it was about the hush. They were crafted by teams of artisans, following detailed cartoons and working with dyed threads that sometimes required entire dyeing guilds to prepare. A single tapestry could cost more than a modest house. They created an emotional silence, even if the city still roared outside, a kind of psychological mute button. Tapestries became a boundary, a polite way of saying, "This space is mine." A pause in the rhythm of Paris. You can feel the texture, the care, the layers of story hidden in wool. A night in one corner, a startled hare in another. You wonder what secrets these walls have heard, in which they've kindly decided not to repeat. Tapestries were immersive. They changed the temperature, the sound, the feeling of a room. But the tapestry holds the space like a velvet guardian. You can breathe in here, but you can feel the truth in your bones. Compared to the crashing noise of the city street, this room is a lullaby in fabric form. It was unteed long before entire households were planned around the feel of a space, not just the look. Thick wall coverings, draped doorways, even hidden alcoves, padded and hung, became retreats from the Parisian din. Think, sleep, even. In a time before insulation, they were the closest thing to a soft wall. Some insist that tapestry's primary role was to show off. A room for reading might feature the Muses or a pastoral scene. A bedroom might show Venus reclining among roses. A dining room here, you're wrapped in wool and woven story. The room doesn't just hold you, it buffers you, perhaps Bacchus, grinning over a feast. Not subtle, but effective. Others argue that their thickness and placement reveal a deeper intent, to soften both drafts and noise. They treated them like we treat a vent, except made of wool, silk, and probably a few poor apprentices' tears. Stitched with care, sometimes imported from the Flemish workshops or woven right here in the Goblin's manufactory, the room feels smaller in a comforting way, like a nest. Your voice drops to a murmur without thinking. Even your shoes seem to forget how to squeak. Perhaps on the better end of the aisle, St. Louis. There's a secret UV yet to see. Rooms that seem to absorb the world. Let's step into one of them now. Imagine you've been invited to the home of a marquise. Thick, colorful cloths hang from them. These are tapestries, and they're not just decoration. They're sound eaters. Mainstream historical fact. Historians agree on their artistic significance. But when it comes to their everyday functionality, specifically sound dampening, the debate is murkier. But as you run your fingers across the threads of this imaginary wall hanging, you can feel it for yourself. It's not just beautifulized practical. And for a world that rarely slept, this was a revelation. Wealthy families started commissioning tapestries not only for ballrooms or great halls, but for more intimate spaces, bedrooms, sitting rooms, studies. But make no mistake, these things were expensive. A full wall tapestry could take years to produce. Quirky tidbit: some aristocrats rented their tapestries for special occasions, weddings, diplomatic visits, or dramatic flair during feasts. For those who couldn't afford full tapestries, there were lesser options. Wall hangings made from layered cloth. Old velvet cloaks repurposed into panels, or patched together tapestries, with stories half lost in the fading. As you stroll deeper into this imagined home, you notice how the tapestry themes begin to echo the purpose of the room. There's a reason so many tapestries featured forests, fountains, soft gardens. These scenes felt quiet, and that silence, however small, was powerful, because the louder the outside world became, the more valuable a quiet room was. You reach out again, brushing imaginary fingertips across the thick weave. Sound is still there, of course. A chair creaks. A servant sneezes somewhere behind a door. Historians still debate whether tapestries truly changed sleep patterns among the wealthy, or if that's just wishful reconstruction. And once the elite embraced it, the fashion spread. You sigh and lean into the imagined softness, letting the hum of the city fade behind you. For the first time today, your shoulders drop. You breathe deep. Quiet, it turns out, isn't a lack of sound. It's a tapestry. Outside, the city roars. Inside, someone is threading silence. You walk now not through the streets of Paris, but through a low, dusty workshop tucked behind the Seine. The windows are streaked with soot. The floor is scuffed by decades of boots and benches, and the air smells like wool, candle wax, and a little bit of hope. This is where the quiet was built, not in palaces, but here, by the hands of weavers who rarely saw the homes their work transformed. Tapestries didn't appear from nowhere. Behind each one was a slow, precise symphony of fingers, fibers, and time. His fingers move with mechanical rhythm, each motion so practiced it feels hypnotic. The wool is dyed with natural pigments, madder for red, woad for blue, and onion skins for warm golds. Some of these dyes are so volatile, they change color under moonlight. Others never fade. Some point to letters from the royal court describing rooms that were blessedly hushed after being properly dressed in goblins. Others say that's reading too much into flowery praise. Either way, the effect was real. He follows a full-scale drawing called a cartoon pinned just behind the loom. Some tapestries were mixed media, woven with metallic thread or embedded with pearls and beads. One particular piece from this era 6-panel series titled "The Month" showed pastoral life through the seasons. It was less about telling a narrative and more about creating a mood. A tapestry wasn't just art, it was atmosphere. Not great for acoustic performance, but stunning under candlelight. Lounging goddesses, all thanks to the aching backs of men and women hunched in these workshops. It's like building a lullaby from bricks and mortar. The tapestry will take years to complete, inch by inch, knot by knot. Weavers would sometimes joke, "We speak with threads, not words," but they knew. They knew that tapestries muffled more than just echoes. Nobles from Spain, Italy, and even as far as Sweden ordered tapestries from this very workshop. It's not only to show off French taste, but to bring that same hush home with them. They softened lives, smoothed harsh corners, turned a clattering hallway into a place where whispers could live. Fitting, isn't it? Music as taming force, art as silence, weaving as control, the clack of loom frames, the soft grunts of labor, the occasional burst of laughter from a corner where two apprentices argue over color palettes. But here in this workshop, silence is being built, slowly, tenderly, one thread at a time. Even this place, for all its precision, is loud in its own way. But here, the noise means something. Every sound has purpose. Every thud is a future hush in some noble's bedroom, promise, quietly sown of peace. And in the 17th century, the best place in France to find those fingers, the manufactured des Gobelins. Not just a woven wall, but an emotional climate. A room wrapped in visual and sensory harmony, a cocoon of status and stillness. This royal tapestry factory, established under Louis XIV's patronage in 1662, housed some of the finest weavers in Europe. They'd glimpse their progress only occasionally, stepping back to admire the slow bloom of the image.
Oh.
It was a bit like painting blindfolded, only with wool and splinters. Some families had passed down the skill for generations. Others were brought in from Flanders, lured by royal incentives and the promise of glory bethread. Their work was shipped off, rolled and wrapped, to country estates or royal apartments. Their names rarely recorded. Their reward modest, though better than most tradesmen. The Gobelins' factory paid well enough to keep talent in one place, but not so well as to breed arrogance. You sit beside a weaver now, your hands in your lap, because this work is not for amateurs. One famous Gobelins tapestry from the era took so long to complete, nearly 12 years, that by the time it was finished, the original patron had died. His estate had crumbled, and his descendants used it as a rug. Tragic, maybe. Soft on the feet? Absolutely. The loom itself is horizontal, the kind that forces a weaver to crouch or bend, like a penitent monk before a cloth altar. Quirky tidbit. But these artisans weren't just making pictures. They were, whether they knew it or not, crafting early sound panels, soft, dense surfaces that tamed echo and swallowed chatter. The tighter the weave, the more noise it absorbed. And these tapestries were tight. Densities could reach up to 10 warps per centimeter. That's more than your average cotton shirt. Historians still argue whether the sound dampening effect was a happy accident or an intentional feature. You run your hand along the unfinished tapestry, feeling where smooth wool meets coarser flax. Each design told a story. Mythological scenes, garden parties, royal hunts. Some were whimsical, others grand. That's what the patrons were buying. You notice the rhythm of the workshop now. The weavers often worked from behind the tapestry, literally weaving in reverse. Some of them never saw the finished piece. It's a strange thing, isn't it? The rich sleeping peacefully behind scenes of hunting stags. There was also a kind of pride in the silence created. And even beyond Paris, the Gobelins' name spread. You glance again at the cartoon pinned to the back wall. It shows a mythological scene, Orpheus lulling the animals with his lyre. The tapestry is only half finished. The threads dangle like loose thoughts. But you can already feel the hush rising from it. And outside, of course, the city still growls. Carts rattle. Bells toll. People shout about bread and gossip. You leave the workshop with wool clinging to your sleeves and a strange hush in your ears. Not silence exactly, but the ghost of it. Paris greets you again with its usual fanfare. The clop of hooves, the babble of merchants, a cat yowling on a rooftop like it's seen the end times. Now something's changed. You've seen what quiet looks like before it's born. You've touched the threads of silence. And once you know that, the noise doesn't hit the same way. It's still there, louder than ever. But you've started to imagine the layers that might hold it back. In certain homes, especially those with long reception rooms or salons, the entire wall would be covered from floor to ceiling and dense narrative cloth. It turned the room into something plush, not just to look at, but to feel. The wealthy of Paris, of course, were far ahead of you. Candles flicker against the threads, casting shadows across painted scenes, Apollo guiding his chariot, shepherds reclining under trees, the occasional unicorn nibbling leaves. Beneath it is stone or timber, cold and hard, but the tapestry makes it feel alive. The wool breathes. It holds warmth. It swallows your voice gently, like a mother calming a fretful child. Everything glows slightly golden. Loud guests feel out of place, like bulls in a velvet maze. And those who linger longest are the ones who lean back into the hush, let it wrap them like a shawl. A soft-spoken retreat from the clamor of the outer world. The goal was to keep the quiet in, like warm air, like perfume. One aristocratic journal from 1684 mentions a guest complaining that the room spoke in whispers and swallowed mine whole. Guests reported feeling slightly judged by the rabbit who shouldn't he have boasted above the fireplace. One poorly ventilated salon might become a feasting ground for tiny wool-eating invaders. It was not uncommon to hear of entire scenes disappearing slowly, first a wing, then a tree, until the noble hunt dissolved into moth dust. They built double walls, hiding a pocket of air between layers of wood and tapestry, an early experiment in what we now call soundproofing. One such room, tucked in a manor near the Marais, was so well insulated it reportedly made guests uneasy. "It is the quietest place I've ever dined," wrote one visitor. "I feared I'd been buried before dessert." She meant it as a criticism. Everyone else called it elegance. And in a city as noisy as Paris, you needed armor. Did the hostesses of the Enlightenment understand they were engineering calm? Or was it all aesthetic, a fortunate byproduct of good taste and deep pockets? And then you step back out, through the curtain, into the noisy corridor of the house. Footsteps return. Voices rise. Tapestries didn't create emptiness. They made space for softness. The gentle brush of slippers, the clink of porcelain, the subtle rustle of pages turning in a book. Entire suites would be lined in matching cloth walls, bed hangings, chair upholstery creating a kind of visual and sonic unity. You wouldn't just see the story, you'd sleep in it. It absorbed not only sound, but soot, grease, gossip. Over time, they needed brushing, shaking, and careful beating, usually outside, over balconies. Like elaborate rugs with delusions of grandeur. Salons, especially those hosted by women of letters, were sometimes planned with acoustics in mind, favoring spaces where wit could be heard without needing to shout over echoes. Even the ceilings weren't immune. In some of the grander estates, fabric was stretched taut overhead, sometimes patterned to match the walls. Other times, a soft, neutral sky to give the illusion of space. The result? Echo had nowhere to go. Your voice landed softly. Your thoughts felt closer. By the latter half of the 17th century, tapestries weren't just luxury items. They were architectural strategy. Could almost forget the goats, the bread sellers, the midnight duels in the street. Almost. Imagine walking into such a room. The door shuts with a gentle click. The noise from the hallway dies instantly. It's quiet. Not eerily so, but warmly.
How the way a library feels
On a snowy afternoon. Or a theater just before the curtain rises. Mainstream historical fact. These lavish rooms were often used for conversation, reading, and what the French lovingly called le repos. Not sleep, exactly but rest. Historians still debate whether these design choices were fully conscious. You run your hand along the edge of one imagined panel. The servants walk softer here. You notice that the space invites quiet behavior. In some cases, tapestries were even paired, with heavy curtains hung over doors, not for insulation, but for acoustics. It's worth noting, tapestries weren't just for showrooms and salons. Bedrooms, too, were draped like cocoons. Quirky tidbit, in one case, a noblewoman commissioned a tapestry series based entirely on her favorite fables, each panel depicting a different animal moral. But the effect was undeniable. In these rooms, the city faded. You look up, and yet even these havens weren't perfect. Tapestries aged, they sagged, and they weren't immune to pests. Moths in particular loved them. Still, despite their upkeep, tapestries endured. More than art, more than insulation, they were aesthetic armor. Some homes even took the idea further. You chuckle at that, because true silence can be unsettling. But this wasn't that. This was not the silence of cathedrals. It was the silence of being safe. You take one more look around the imagined room, the woven scenes, the dustless air, the hush that holds you like a lullaby. But for a moment, you carry the quiet with you, like the aftertaste of honey. You step outside the manor house, blinking against the rude enthusiasm of daylight. Paris is fully awake now, and it doesn't take care that you've just come from a chamber dressed in velvet hush. The street is a cacophony once again, horses snorting, children shrieking. An argument somewhere over pears that clearly went bad too quickly. Not everyone can afford woven forests and scenes from Roman epics stitched into their walls. Still, your ears feel different, tuned. You begin to notice the layers, the rhythms beneath the noise. The building leans slightly, like it's tired of standing straight. Inside, a modest apartment has been transformed with whatever materials its occupants could gather: old quilts tacked to walls, sacks of grain stacked against thin partitions, heavy drapes hung over window cracks. You're not rich, but you are resourceful. The way a wheel clatters differently on cobble versus dirt. The echo of footsteps under archways. The uneven cadence of a man hawking wine bottles from a cart with one busted wheel. Apparently, raw cabbage has a curious density and odor-absorbing quality. Poor man's insulation, if you will. Don't knock it until you've tried it. The etiquette of silence didn't rely on physical barriers. It lived in the mutual understanding that we all need a moment of peace now and then. Even if that moment was stolen at midday, behind a curtain, under a blanket, while the world clattered on outside. But the results were the same. Accidental soundproofing, especially in the tenements. The window is stuffed with old lace and hay to keep the draft and the noise at bay. Footsteps pass overhead, but they're soft, distant. You exhale. You've made your peace with the noise. Not by escaping it, but by dulling its sharpest edges. Some abbeys hung modest wall cloths in private cells or refectories, not to impress, but to soothe, to soften the echo of stone chambers designed to humble the body and elevate the soul. In both the chateau and the cloister, sound became something sacred, either to enjoy in precise doses or to banish entirely. One family might share a room with 3 others. Privacy wasn't just rare, it was mythical, so people developed a kind of cultural noise filter. Guests were discouraged from laughing too loudly. Quiet became a fashion, sign of intelligence, restraint, modernity, a kind of hallowed hush, a place where your breath sounded too loud, or even prayer felt like an interruption. It helped prevent disputes, or at least delayed them. If nothing else, it made tenants feel a little more civilized. And whether you were layering cabbage leaves in your window, or commissioning a scene of Diana the Huntress to swallow your footstep echoes, the goal was the same. Paris, the loudest city in France, had started whispering. A little more buffered from each other's chewing, arguing, and more intimate sounds. You learned to tune things out, to sleep through coughing, muttering, creaking, a signal that you could choose what entered your ears and when. For them, silence was not luxury or necessity, was devotion. Outside, Paris shouts, but inside the world is soft, kind, even, spiritual discipline. It became background music, annoying at first, soothing eventually. All of it reminds you. Paris doesn't just make noise, it wears it. And hanging clothing from ceiling beams common in cramped quarters created a curious canopy effect, deadening echoes and keeping the air still. Thick, dusty curtains, sometimes made from old coats or stitched together scraps, became prized possessions, passed down like heirlooms, not for beauty, for blessed, sacred, quiet. But where do you go when the noise becomes too much? That's why in the less glamorous corners of the city, people got creative. Let's head there now. A narrow stairwell creaks beneath your feet. Historians still debate the extent to which working-class Parisians actively attempted to manipulate their sonic environments, or whether their makeshift methods were simply for warmth. Layered fabrics meant muffled neighbors. Grain sacks soaked up sound as well as moisture. It's not glamorous, but it works. And don't forget about the furniture. Large wooden armoires, when placed strategically, could block noise from next door. Quirky tidbit. There are records of apartment dwellers using cabbage leaves between wall cracks to dull sound. Still, noise was inevitable. In these spaces, walls were thin, but ears were forgiving. Some landlords even encouraged the use of cloth wall coverings, not tapestries, but rough wool sheets or extra linens as a way to quiet the house. You sit now in one such room. It's dim but warm. A pot simmers gently in the corner. This is what most Parisians lived with. Not silence, but less sound. And that was enough. Now, shift your gaze east. Beyond the walls of the city lies another kind of silence, the enforced kind. Monasteries, few places in 17th century. France understood the value of quiet like the cloistered communities of monks and nuns. Inside these stone enclaves, tapestries were rare, but not unheard of. The effect? Historians still argue whether monastic silence influenced broader French design, or whether the two developed in parallel. But the parallels are hard to ignore. And for a time, even the wealthiest nobles flirted with this idea. Rooms were built without music. You smile to yourself. That's the irony, isn't it? The richer the home, the quieter the space. Yeah. The more noise you had outside, the more you longed for stillness inside. Control. A quiet room wasn't just an escape. It was a kind of power. You lie back on a threadbare cot in a working-class apartment, now tapestry's just a dream, but a wool blanket draped across the nearest wall. And for the first time all day, you feel something unusual blooming in your chest. Stillness. You wake not with a start, but with a sigh. The room is dim. The sounds outside your window still dance their clumsy ballopots clanging, hooves clattering. Someone arguing about cheese with more passion than any war council, but inside, the layers of cloth and cleverness have done their job. You've slept. And in 17th century Paris, that's a minor miracle. Now, as you stretch, the world creeps back and but gentler this time. You've come to appreciate its texture. The city doesn't just make sound, it performs it. Each alleyway, each shutter, each echoing rooftop adds its note to the great Parisian symphony. A private music room, lined floor to ceiling with tapestries specifically chosen, not just for beauty, but for tone. But this morning, you have an errand. Music becomes more refined violins, lutes, harpsichords weaving together in chamber. Pieces Parisian elites begin to notice that certain rooms ruin the sound. Too echoey, too drafty, too boomy. The solution? Textiles, lots of them. You re-off to visit one of the newest trends sweeping the fashionable quarters of Paris. An interior display so decadent, so theatrical, it borders on spiritual, not musical tone, atmospheric tone. You spot Cleo, muse of history, with her scroll unfurled. She winks almost. The late 17th century saw an explosion in domestic music making, especially among the educated and wealthy. Scientific tests suggest only minor absorption compared to today's engineered materials. But when you're sitting in this room, with music spiraling through air softened by centuries of wool, none of that matters. The room barely echoes. It hums with softness. The music begins, and it's like you're inside a thought, the intimacy. The way sound lives here without bouncing off into oblivion. You can hear each pluck, each breath, each pause. It's not about volume, it's about presence. It wasn't unusual for a household to host evening recitals or intimate performances with family members playing for small groups of guests. But the music, delicate and airy, needed the right setting. That noise can bruise, and silence can soothe. It's a curious shift in culture. A single note hangs in the air, suspended like dew, and then it fades slowly, beautifully, into the softness of wool. Preparing for a musical evening meant more than dusting and arranging candles. It meant fluffing the wall hangings, adjusting curtain folds, sometimes even misting the fabric to enhance its texture and reduce static, noticing every doorway with a thick curtain, every house with a woven panel above the hearth, every silence someone bothered to sow. Light, flirtatious scenes for harpsichord solos, dramatic battles for minor key sonatas. One eccentric gentleman reportedly owned a tapestry depicting musical angels that he only unveiled during performances of sacred music. You hear not just the loudness, but the gaps, those precious pockets of stillness between voices, between cartwheels, between one breath and the next. The rest of the time, it was rolled up and stored behind a screen. Mainstream historical fact? Hung not just on walls, but sometimes even draped across ceilings. They transformed rooms into plush theaters. The music didn't just plate floated. Hard surfaces muddled the melodies. So the solution, gleaned perhaps from ecclesiastical acoustics and monastic hush, was to soften the space. Outside the city grumbles on, but in here, wrapped in thread and harmony, it's distant, like another world. Tapestries, with their dense wool and lush imagery, became the preferred soundscape. Even those with limited means began creating music corners in their homes. A wall draped with a single cloth, a chair angled just so, a shelf lined with books to absorb the sharpness. It wasn't a performance hall, but it was enough. You step into one such room now, your footsteps muted instantly. The space smells of beeswax and faint lavender. The instruments gleam in the candlelight, an ornate harpsichord, a viol da gamba, a small harp leaning like it's resting. Everywhere around you, stories in thread, a hunt scene, pastoral picnic, a rendering of the muses gathered on Mount Helicon, each holding her cymbal. The host is already seated, tuning a lute with careful fingers. Historians still argue whether tapestries truly improved acoustics in any measurable way. What matters is the feeling. A quirky tidbit. Some hosts even had themed tapestries to match the music. The servants in these houses knew the tapestry routine well. You sit now, listening. The music swells. The room holds it close. It's not hard to see why people started copying this idea. You begin to notice that quiet is not just something we seek. It's something we create, actively, thoughtfully, with layers and care. Even now, in the age of stone and soot, people are shaping their lives around the idea that sound matters. You lean back, letting the music finish. The room doesn't erupt with applause, it sighs, and so do you. Later, walking home through the still busy streets, you find your ears sharper, and suddenly, you're craving them, collecting them because the city will always be noisy. But now you know, the quiet isn't missing, it's hiding. Someone somewhere is weaving more of it even now. Evening returns to Paris like it always does, slowly, with a kind of tired flourish. The sky turns copper, the shadows stretch long across the cobbles, and the city exhales. The light fades. You start noticing something you missed in the full glare of day. Windows glowing behind layers of fabric, thick drapes, wall cloths, tapestries, some faded, others freshly hung. The worst of the noise lingers, bells tolling the hour, distant arguments echoing down alleys, but for the first time all day, it feels manageable, almost melodic. You're walking along the Rue Saint, now shoes soft against the worn stone. Even outside, the quiet work of tapestries continues. But now we turn to a different layer of their purpose, one that's even less discussed than sound: memory. Because if there's one thing a tapestry does better than nearly any other object, it's remember. Mainstream historical fact, tonight you sense there's more than beauty here. There's memory, the kind you don't speak aloud, the kind you let the walls whisper for you. Winter called for warm, gold-toned hangings with scenes of hearth and harvest. Summer demanded lighter panels, cool blues, flowing rivers, perhaps a sleepy mythological scene where not much happened. Many 17th century tapestries were not one-offs. They came in series narratives spread across multiple panels, each telling a part of a greater story. Or the year the vineyard failed and they learned how quickly the taste of wine could vanish from their table. Others think they were simply artistic trends, heavy on allegory, but light on actual reference. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the weave. Little ways of saying, yes, time passed here. People lived here. The lamps are lit, the streets glow amber, but you stay here, surrounded by wool and story. You place your palm against the weave. It's not cold. It never is. It holds warmth. It holds time. Holds everything that couldn't be said aloud. They heard things, felt things, and decided to remember in softness. Choosing what to hear or not hear based on how you felt. And that's kind of beautiful. Background rabbit might suddenly wear a collar. A knight's sword might take on a floral pattern decades later. Tiny edits. Quiet jokes. Family in-jokes. Sewn in wool. Like someone breathing beside you, slow and even, The sound of the city dulled into a blur, the creak of a wooden chair, the distant sound of music from a street performer several blocks away. Families would commission tapestries to commemorate marriages, victories, births, land acquisitions, and sometimes quietly even scandals. A scene of a ship at sea, nothing grand, just a crew pulling oars, the waves rolling. A soft refusal to let the world rush in too fast. But someone's added a small crescent moon in the top corner, stitched in with slightly brighter thread. You don't know when it was added or why, but it feels like a whisper in the ear. Someone wanted that moon there. Someone needed it. Visually, orally, emotionally. They told stories with threads so that their minds might settle, so that their rooms would not only look calm but sound and feel calm. Not with portraits, but with metaphors. A lion standing over a subdued boar, a falcon clutching a ribbon, a shepherdess, alone, beside a tree with no leaves. The most famous examples, like the history of Alexander or the hunts of Maximilian, weren't just decoration. They were history books in wool, silent chronicles, and in Parisian homes, they became personal archives. The stories weren't overt, but they were understood. You just had to know how to read them. And when these tapestries were hung in quiet rooms, the silence deepened. Not just acoustically, but emotionally. 'Cause now, every hush held meaning. Every glance at the wall reminded you. This room remembers. Historians still argue about how literal these metaphor-laden tapestries were meant to be. Some suggest they were coded messages, like visual diaries. But you can feel it. As you step into a sitting room of a retired courtier, walls wrapped in scenes of forests, a tapestry might show a fox beneath a grapevine butt. To the family who hung it, it marked the year uncle was caught cheating at cards. Quirky tidbit? Some households actually rotated their tapestries seasonally, not just to protect them from light and soot, but to control the mood. They treated their walls the way you might treat a playlist, because in a time before therapy, before mindfulness apps or noise-canceling headphones, this was how people regulated their senses. And even when the stories on the wall grew old, they weren't discarded. They were mended, patched, occasionally embroidered with additions. You crouch in front of one now. It's fraying at the edges, but still bold. And you realize even the patches are part of the silence. They're not interruptions. They're acknowledgments. By now, the sky outside has deepened to indigo. And then, gently you hear it. The room has a voice. Not words. Just a feeling. A hum in the chest. A steadiness. The tapestry listens. And so do you. Because this isn't just decoration. This is a memory machine. Noise filter. And it works. Even centuries later, you're back outside again and the city is doing what it always does best, refusing to rest. The bells toll the hour with theatrical insistence. A dog barks at a chicken that has no business being on a city street. Somewhere a lover's quarrel spills from a window in tragic operatic tones. You almost admire the consistency of it all. You walk the streets not in protest of the clamor, but in quiet pursuit of those little spaces where stillness survives. Specifically to a curious little guild hall where tapestries weren't just decorations or dampeners, they were tools. Tailors, candle makers, spice grinders, even tooth pullers each had their codes, their apprenticeships, their inner circles, teaching tools. And yet, because now you've seen what hides behind the noise, you no longer feel trapped by it. You're heading east, toward a part of Paris less known for opulence and more known for its peculiar hobbies. Mainstream historical fact: in the 17th century, Paris was home to dozens of craft guilds, each fiercely protective of its secrets and its pride. But among the more curious was the De Lectores Mutes, the Brotherhood of Silent Readers. But they don't need to. Not complex sign language, just simple gestures. A tap to the wrist for time to go, a two-finger wave for pass the book, and, charmingly, a flutter of the hand for the page made me smile. The silence speaks for them. A room where noise wasn't banished angrily, but simply never invited in. Where every surface was chosen not just for beauty or prestige, but for what it could muffle. Not just quiet voices. Literal silence. Their meetings forbade spoken words entirely. And to aid this solemn practice, they employ used tapestries. One series even illustrated famous quotes, not written out, but interpreted symbolically. It just waits, like a kind dog beside your chair, not asking, just being. Some claim they were dismissed as eccentrics, oddballs with too much time and too much wool. Others argue that they helped inspire later Enlightenment ideas about contemplative thought and inner life. A candle flickering for enlightenment. A pair of clasped hands over a closed book for restraint. Sound like something out of a novel? You're not far off. Tucked somewhere behind your ribs. The room is swaddled in thick woolen panels, each one a quiet sermon in thread. You smile, not in irritation but in contrast. Because now you know what the opposite of this sounds like. You feel as if you've stepped into the lungs of a sleeping beast. The air is that still. They were a small, intellectual society devoted to the private, meditative reading of sacred and philosophical text, entirely in silence. Specifically commissioned for the Brotherhood. These wall hangings depicted not religious iconography or mythological dramas, but textual imagery. Images of books opening, quills floating, eyes gazing downward. You step inside their reading hall now, only a handful of people remain. Their silhouettes hunched over scrolls and leather-bound volumes. No one looks up. Quirky tidbit. The Brotherhood reportedly used a system of hand signals to communicate during sessions. Historians still argue whether the Brotherhood had any real influence beyond their tiny circle. Whatever the truth, you can't deny the space they created. You linger there a while, breathing in the scent of parchment and dyed thread, letting the soft silence fill your ears like warm sand. It strikes you. This kind of quiet doesn't demand your attention. It doesn't even beg to be noticed. And when you leave, stepping once more into the blur of Parisian life, you take a piece of that silence with you. Even the tavern you pass on the way home, the one blasting cheerful lute music and bellowed drinking songs, feels different now. And once you know, you can always find it again. In a church, in a bedroom, in the hush before a page turns, in a wall hanging that depicts nothing at all but a moon, a cat, and a field of stitched silence, you don't head home just yet. There is one last place pulling you forward, one last corner of Paris, where silence was in tea crafted for royalty, or musicians, or secretive scholars. It was made for healing. It's a curious paradox, a place filled with the sick, the wounded, the dying, and yet a place that sought, in its own threadbare way, to preserve peace. At least, as much as any institution filled with coughing monks and unmedicated patients could manage. Though rarely mentioned in modern retellings, several hospitals and almshouses in 17th century France utilized textiles in their patient wards, not just for warmth, but to manage sound and light. In the absence of proper insulation, and with stone walls that turned every whisper into a scream, cloth was the only buffer they had. You walk now toward the Hotel Dieu, Paris's oldest hospital. The year is somewhere around 1680. The corridors smell faintly of vinegar, old plaster, and boiled herbs. Le pet au corps, le pet à l'âme, as one physician wrote. Modern scholars are unconvinced. But the idea persisted for decades. Patients would request a blue wall the same way we might ask for cool compresses. The peace of the body begins with the peace of the soul. The coughs are softened, the footsteps muffled. You can hear the rustle of a nurse's apron as she adjusts a patient's blanket. Sometimes no more than rough woolen cloth stitched with simple patterns, geometric swirls, a sprig of rosemary, a bluebird in flight. The truth? Probably both. When you're ill, the difference between echoing screams and softened sighs feels like healing, even if it isn't. One of the threads sticks out where a nurse probably caught it with her basket, but it still hangs, absorbing more than sound. But they are there on the walls of recovery rooms and the nooks where the poor were nursed back to almost health. These tapestries weren't hung to impress guests. They were hung to preserve dignity. To say, your suffering doesn't have to echo, not thinking about nobility or art, or gild secrets, but simply letting the silence lull them into whatever sleep they could manage. It was a threat. And tucked between the shrines and the sleeping quarters, you find something unexpected: tapestries. Not the grand woven epics of the goblins. These are simpler, modest, mainstream historical fact, and make no mistake, noise was more than an annoyance. That slow drift. Because in this room, even you could fall asleep. A shaft of moonlight filters through the curtained window, illuminating the stitches of a tiny embroidered rosal someone's small edition, maybe long ago. A nurse whispers a prayer over a sleeping patient. Outside, the river rolls on. Doctors of the time, those halfway between science and alchemy, believed that rest was the single most essential element in recovery, and peace is nearly impossible with 36 people groaning in echo chambers. They were for everyone. Wherever people needed less noise, less glare, fewer sharp edges, they wove their way in, quietly, without fanfare. Sometimes rejects from a noble house that no longer wanted a tapestry with a slightly lopsided griffin, so they hung cloth. On walls, over beds, even draped from ceilings when they could. Sometimes it was old altar cloth. Porky tidbit. A particularly eccentric doctor at Hotel Dieu swore that lining a patient's wall with blue-dyed cloth helped reduce fevers. You step inside one such ward now. It's quiet and not truly silent, but quieter than you'd expect. It's not glamorous, but it's kind. And for the poor, the injured, the overlooked, kindness mattered more than grandeur. Historians still argue whether this use of textiles was medically effective or merely palliative. And in a city as brutal and relentless as Paris, even a few hours of peace could mean the difference between life and death. Run your hand over the edge of a faded wall hanging. It's patched in 3 places. Grief. Pain. Whispers. You imagine someone lying here 100 years ago, staring at that same patch of wool. You feel that lull now. And that's the magic of it all. Because tapestries weren't just for chateaus and salons, in the halls of kings, the corners of slums, in the wards of the dying. Soft things, doing quiet work for loud lives. You take a final look around the room, and inside, silence holds. The moon follows you home. It hangs low over the rooftops as you wind your way through sleeping streets. Paris is quieter now, not silent, never that but hushed. It's a kind of hush that feels earned, as if the city itself has finally, reluctantly, decided to rest. You pass shuttered shops, empty carriages, and cats who stare at you like they know something you don't. You slip inside, and the warmth welcomes you like a well-worn coat. The walls are plain, the furniture simple, but even in this humble little home you've made space for softness. Maybe they do. Maybe they've always known that silence is something you cultivate, not stumble into, like a garden or a story, stitched leaf pattern that doesn't quite match on each side. You didn't hang it for fashion. You hung it because once a neighbor told you that old linen keeps the walls from talking too loud. Your feet find familiar cobblestones, and soon you're at your door. There's a worn cloth hanging above your hearth, faded indigo. The night air slips under the window pane, cool and a little damp. You pull your blanket up to your chin, and as you do, you hear it, that perfect, almost forgotten sound. And now you believe her. Tonight, you light a single candle and settle onto your cot. They began appearing in inns, libraries, convents, and even boarding schools. Was it simply about warmth and noise, or had people begun to believe that peace was something you could weave? France's growing merchant class adopted them as both decorative and practical items, layering them over doors, placing them behind beds, using them to divide rooms in cramped quarters. Nothing. To hush. To cradle, the cloth on your wall might not be royal or rare or valuable, but it works. Parish churches or town councils kept collections of old cloth panels, offering them to families in need during illness, childbirth, or mourning. A quiet act of quiet-making, not because of how it looks, but because of how it feels, what it gives you. A horse breathing outside, but in here, the air holds still. The cloth on your wall has absorbed the sharpness. The walls no longer echo your smallest exhale, or at least almost nothing. A muffled step above. This room is not silent because it is empty. It is silent because it is soft. Mainstream historical fact? By the end of the 17th century, tapestries had moved beyond aristocratic status symbols. The idea of the quiet room began to spread not as a luxury, but as a right. Everyone deserved one space, however modest, where sound could not bruise you. Historians still argue whether this democratization of textile decor was driven by practicality or by shifting cultural ideals. Either way, it changed homes across France and far beyond. Quirky tidbit, in some towns, tapestries were lent out like books, and so here you lie, in a room shaped by centuries of that impulse. To soften, it holds the day at bay. And you realize, staring at the flickering shadow it casts on the ceiling, that this humble hanging might be your favorite possession, not just quiet, but a way to breathe in the middle of a city that never truly sleeps. A breath becomes a yawn. The candle burns lower. Outside, the moon tilts, as if bowing to the rooftop chimneys in quiet gratitude. No. In here, in your small stitched sanctuary, you feel something shift. Not the room, not the city. You are resting. Morning arrives not with a crash, but with a whisper. Wake slowly, as if pulled upward by thread. Outside, Paris begins its routine, chorus wheels turning, doors slamming. A rooster who has clearly never respected human sleep schedules, but here, in your quiet room, the sounds filter in like distant memories. Not by creating perfect silence, but by softening the corners, blunting the blows. It's like falling asleep with someone's hand gently resting over your ears. The wall hanging has done its job again. You stretch beneath your blanket, gaze up at the ceiling, and let your thoughts drift. When they're too faded to impress, too torn to mend, too patched to pass on, you start wondering, what happens to all these tapestries, these woolen witnesses, when they outlive their usefulness? Do they disappear? Not always. Today you're heading to the fringes of Paris to a workshop where worn tapestries go not to die but to be reborn. In the late 1600s, particularly as the tapestry industry boomed, a secondary economy emerged. The refurbishment and repurposing of older, damaged tapestries. These workshops, some officially sanctioned by the Crown, others quietly operating on the edge of legality, took apart damaged panels. There is at least one record of a magistrate wearing a cape made from part of a tapestry that once hung in the Louvre. Others praised it as the natural second life of fabric that had already lived long and well, transformed them into everything from bed canopies to folding screens, altar cloths, fire screens, and winter curtains for drafty inns. The center panel is gone, but he's reworking the corners to serve as a fire screen. It has no figures, no story, no famous threadwork, just ivy, and yet it hums with a kind of peace, still dulls the noise. Remember something you might have forgotten. Another worker is carefully cutting silhouettes from a ruined mythological scene to create pieces for new cloths. Mainstream historical fact? Tapestries hang like sleeping giants from wooden pegs. Some are faded to ghost colors to soften, to salvage. The old churches with faded wall hangings still catching echoes. The forgotten coat in someone's attic stitched with thread that once heard a symphony. Paris is at full volume again. Carts rumble, voices rise, bells ring with all the grace of a cow tripping down a staircase. Oh, but you're not overwhelmed. Others show only fragments: a hand, a wing, a tree that no longer leads anywhere. You step into one such place now. The air smells of dust, dye, and something faintly metallic: scissors, needles, and time itself. It's oddly beautiful. She places it carefully into a basket labeled "Quiet Inn Scraps," reserved for homes that need insulation more than imagery. It's not shouting their presence, just being. You watch as a young woman cuts a frayed edge from an old hunting scene. She doesn't discard it. Man beside her stitches a new border around what was once a grand epic. Quirky tidbit: some tailors even used tapestry fragments in clothing particularly heavy coats and travel cloaks, which benefited from the thick, wind-resistant weave. Historians still argue whether this repurposing was considered practical recycling or quiet scandal. Some viewed it as sacrilege, especially if religious or royal symbols were cut. You run your hand over a piece in the corner, just a square, really, the edge of what might have once been a garden scene. That's the thing, isn't it? Even in pieces, the tapestry does its work. Even as a curtain in an inn, or the lining of a winter shawl, or a forgotten square nailed behind a drafty cupboard, it still offers warmth. And here, in this workshop of soft ruins, you realize quiet is not a single event. It's a series of decisions. To save, to say, this isn't over yet. You leave the shop as the sun hits its stride, flooding the street in gold, because now you can imagine all the places the noise is being held back. The little rented rooms with curtain-lined corners, They're everywhere, these pockets of hush. You carry that with you as you head home again. Back to your own quiet wall. Back to the stitched leaf. It's back to the silence you've built, one thread at a time. Night falls again, this time more softly than before. The city seems to breathe slower in the dark, as though it too is weary from a day of endless chatter. You arrive at your door, and there's a calmness in your shoulders now. The wooden floor creaks only once beneath your foot like it's greeting you. And the cloth on your wall, that quiet patch of faded indigo, it greets you too. You've walked across Paris, listened to its rhythms, peeked behind its curtains, and you've returned not just to your home, but to your refuge. It's different now, not just absence, not just muffled noise, but a presence. But in private homes, especially in older parts of Paris, they lingered, quietly, stubbornly, not because they were fashionable, but because they worked. The humble apartments with cabbage leaf insulation, the monastery chambers wrapped in sacred hush, the hospital ward where silence was mercy, the workshop of forgotten threads, patiently turning scraps into comfort, the kind of silence that has a shape, character, a memory of every soft thing you've seen. Inside, your room welcomes you with its usual hush. The candle you light flickers but doesn't crackle. You sit for a moment in the stillness, letting the silence soak in like warm water. In your single room, the cloth on your wall watches you, silent and patient. In the air between your breaths, it reminds you of the palace drawing rooms. All of it lives here somehow, in muffled grief. They made sleep just a little more possible. In one Paris census from the late 1700s, a widow in her 60s was listed as owning a single valuable item, un morceau de tapisserie, suspendu contre le vent, a tapestry scrap hung against the wind. It had no known origin, no known value, but it was named, it was remembered. Mainstream historical fact: by the early 18th century, tapestries began to wane in popularity, outpaced by painted panels, wallpaper, and changing tastes. They held stories, and in that, they earned their place. Quirky tidbit: historians still argue whether these scraps and hangings should be considered art, architecture, or artifact. But maybe there's something else entirely. Maybe they're promises. Soft-spoken promises stitched across centuries that your home can hold you gently, that your pain doesn't need to echo, that the noise of the world can pause just for a little while. You lie back now, blanket drawn high, candle wick trembling toward sleep. And just before your eyes close, you remember something. Silence isn't an accident, it's an invitation to rest, to dream, to wake again with a little more calm than before. Now, let it all slow down. Let the city drift away behind its walls of thread and stone. Let the footsteps fade into the distance. The arguments dissolve into murmurs. The bells hush themselves like bedtime lullabies. Your room holds steady. The air thickens with softness. The shadows no longer frighten, they soothe. They stretch like velvet over every corner, muffling the hard edges of the day. The tapestry above your bed still sways ever so slightly in the nighttime air, not from breeze, but from memory. You've traveled far tonight through salons and alleyways, courts and convents, workrooms and whispers. You've seen how a piece of wool and dye could transform not just a room, but a soul. You've seen how silence isn't something you find, but something you make. Let your breath deepen, slower now, calmer now, and now it's your turn. Sink into your mattress. Feel your weight settle into the earth. The day can wait. The noise can wait. Right now, you are inside the hush. You are wrapped in woven quiet. You are home. And in this gentle, padded corner of the world, the only thing you need to do is nothing at all. Just rest. Sleep well, my friend. The city will still be there tomorrow, but tonight, the silence belongs to you.